Okay. Hi, everyone, and a very happy Monday to all of you. My name is Sandhya Ladha, and I work at Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition. I'll be leading you through this network priority tool tonight. We also have today with us Emma Schlees, our Deputy Director at Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition, and John Cordis, my counterpart, who is the Santa Clara County Advocate. We also have with us Michael Seth Wexler, Director of North American Office at Copenhagenized Design Company, who helped us design this tool. Michael lives in Montreal, and since it's a very late hour for him, he will be joining us only for the first half. I will definitely keep some time for questions before he leaves. We'll get started, and John and Emma, you can let people in on the way, and feel free to post any questions you have in the chat box at any time during the presentation. We have time to answer them in between sections. Also, if we use any terms or jargons which you're unable to understand, feel free to ask in the chat box. We will also be recording this forum so that you can view it again later. Again, thank you everyone for joining us at this late hour on a Monday evening. So let's get started. Most of you here already know about Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition, but just to give you a quick glimpse once again, SVBC is a nonprofit, a member-based organization, and we work in both San Mateo and Santa Clara counties. The current average of bicycle trips in both counties is 1%, and SVBC has an ambitious goal of having 10% trips by bike by 2025. Michael, can you introduce yourself and also talk a little about Copenhagenize?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sandhya. So I'm Michael, as Sandhya said. I'm here in Montreal on the East Coast, joining you guys this evening. Happy to be here. And it's nice to be part of this after a long process working with SVBC. I guess it was probably 8 to 10 months, all in all, that we're developing the tool together. So it's really nice to be here to talk about it tonight. And a quick note about who we are as an organization. We are a small consultancy based in Copenhagen as our main office, and our general inspiration in a lot of the work we do, and with offices in Paris and here in Montreal. And a big reason that Copenhagen is our inspiration is that it's a city that's been able to, since the 60s and 70s, go from having a fairly modest bicycle modal share to having one of the strongest in the world and one of the most inspiring observations of cargo bikes and gender split on bikes and bicycle bridges and all these wonderful things. So we have a mission and a goal to try to share as much of this learning with the world as possible, doing that through planning and design. So working on projects like this, like we did with SVBC, or working right now, for example, with the county of Santa Cruz on their active transportation plan. We'll do things like communications and education, which also all bleed into one another to be able to talk about cycling, urban cycling, as much as possible. And then if anybody's interested, please check out our index, the Copenhagenize Index, at copenhagenize.eu, where we rank the world's bicycle-friendly cities and sort of develop a comprehensive methodology. So I guess some of that methodology talk will tie into today, but back to you, Sandhya.
Thank you, Michael. Also, thanks again for joining us at this late hour. So the agenda for today is we'll start off with background and purpose of creating this tool. Then we'll dive deeper into understanding this network priority tool and how exactly can it be used. Then John will lead us through a section where he'll talk about how this was tested in Sunnyvale and what were the results in comparison with the Sunnyvale Active Transportation Plan. And finally, we'll wrap up with conclusion, limitations of this tool, and next steps. So before we jump into the tool, here is a brief background. So every city, as you all know, generally has a bike ped plan, a plan that describes long-range objectives for developing infrastructure and for developing bicycle policies. Each of this plan has a long list of projects, and these projects are nothing but improvements on streets that need to be done, like adding bicycle lanes or maybe intersection improvements and so on. And the project list can have hundreds of projects. So then these projects are generally prioritized based on different criteria. So each city might select different criteria based on what goals they have. It could be population density, it could be a number of crashes that corridor has seen, or proximity to destinations and so on. So each city identifies these criteria and then they arrive at their project list. Now, this criteria varies from city to city or jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So our idea was to create a standardized tool that can be used across all cities in San Mateo and Santa Clara County, and it can be also used across a multi-jurisdiction area. A tool that can be used by the city on their own, and also a tool that can be used by any individual or any other organization as well. Michael will now take us through more specifics of the tool.
Sure, thanks, Sanjay. So following on what Sanjay said, I think the idea behind the network priority tool was really to create something that could be used and reused, and as Sanjay said, standardized and compared across the 2-county area, and ultimately used by anybody who would like to use the tool. So being rooted in advocacy, the idea here was how can we help guide SVBC in the development of this process with open source tools. And just so happens to be that in our practice as well, we generally tend to use a lot of these open source tools for bike and pedestrian plans and things of the like. So the idea here was, can we base this tool in GIS, in using publicly available data that we can find on government websites and whatnot around the 2-county area or in specific municipalities, and then be able to manipulate that data in such a way that it can then be used as the backbone that's constantly used for all of future analyses with this tool. So the goal in this is fairly strongly stated, in that the goal is to prioritize a low stress bike network for all ages and abilities, for all users. So the idea here was, how do we start to identify corridors? How do we start to say, what would the ideal network be for people of all ages and abilities, and go a little bit deeper, and at the same time a little bit more higher level than sometimes we see in a lot of city bike plans. So instead of looking at every single little potential project and piece of a network that can come together, to try to understand what are those larger corridors in the city in question, based on a number of important parameters. And our role really in this was to try to be sparring partners and guiding SVBC in finding a methodology that was really tailored to the 2-county area, that really spoke to the needs and the reality on the ground in San Mateo and Santa Clara counties. I guess we can move to the next slide, Sanjay. So then the output of the tool in and of itself, other than ultimately prioritizing a list of corridors, like I said, so identifying those long range and sometimes medium range connectors through municipality that need prioritization because they hit a number of factors today of not being safe enough or not offering adequate equity and distribution for a network throughout that community. Beyond the development of that map to show those prioritized corridors, the idea was these corridors should also be able to demonstrate what bike facility is really being proposed. So the idea behind this tool was really to be able to use it as a storytelling vehicle, to be able to say, based on this story of these parameters in this sort of weighting system in conjunction, this is where we can really see the need for a connection here, 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 and here. And based on the existing parameters of how many lanes and what the speed of vehicles are on these specific corridors that need to be prioritized, we ultimately are then saying, okay, this street, if it's going to be prioritized and it's going to be appropriate for people of all ages and all abilities, new potential cyclists, people who may not have ridden before and could and would for some movement in their life in the future, this would require a class 4 facility, or this would require a class 1 off-street connecting parallel to a corridor like that. So ultimately, to come through this whole storytelling ability, this whole storytelling endeavor, was to say, where can we prioritize actual connectors and corridors that get people through a community and not just little pieces that start and stop? And how can we then say those priorities need to be given, X, Y, Z, I'm Canadian, level of design intervention beyond that? I think we can go to the next slide, Sandhya. Oh, jumping ahead there, cool. So speaking of these criteria, which is essentially what makes the sort of bread and butter of the tool, ultimately comes down to 17 criteria that we developed through the sort of pre-testing phase of the tool, and then continued to refine it on the Sunnyvale model, which John will talk about later, I believe. So just to quickly explain what all these categories are, and then we can quickly talk about what some of that weighting and sub-weighting looks like. And then I'll pass it off to Sandhya to go a little bit more into detail on each of these criteria to understand where the data comes from, how it was processed, and how it's sort of used in the tool to sort of create that comprehensive storytelling piece, as I mentioned. So if we look along those 17 parameters on the screen, 17 criteria, we broke them into 4 different major buckets, and things had jumped back and forth, but we kind of settled on these 4 in the end, where the first one here on the far left is what we called high need areas. And this includes a number of parameters from population density to local indicators of concern, the MTC, communities of concern indicator, to mobility access or vehicular access, to income levels, to families with single parent households, and to English not being the main language spoken at home. In the second category, we talk about destinations. So here we created buffers. Generally, in most situations, it turned into quarter-mile buffers, which is what we often define as a walkable buffer. So we want to make sure that there is a walkability, accessibility to corridors in the bicycle network when we're doing this analysis. So we're talking about accessibility to job sites. We're talking about accessibility to community destinations, which is very, I'm assuming Sandhya and John will describe this later, but it's really defined based on every project. That one's very user generated. And then access to public transport. Then the third category is harm reduction, as we call it. And the goal here is to map out where have crashes happened, where are high crash corridors, and where have fatalities occurred, and making sure that we can account in our scoring for all 3 of those different things to be able to see some of the subtleties between those different criteria and parameter. Then we're looking at schools. So instead of having schools and senior centers in our destinations, because for us, they're a very important marker of safety and harm reduction, if we can protect corridors that run within this quarter-mile buffer, this walkable buffer of our schools and our senior centers, we can reduce harm by lowering speeding and protecting from vehicular traffic. And then our final category, our final bucket, if you will, is this bike network connectivity, which was also a very important category. And here we have a connectivity score, a slope score, an existing connection score to protected connections, and a gap score. So I can talk a little bit more in detail of those 17 right now on the next slide. Oh, and I was also supposed to mention one thing here too. We also wanted to just make it clear that there was also a lot of sort of back and forth and comparison with a lot of other local existing guidelines. So specifically the VTA guidelines and the Measure W guidelines, those are ones that we cross-reference multiple times. And once Sunnyvale was being used as the test case, we had the Sunnyvale Active Transportation Plan sort of breakdown methodology as well. So we were able to look at everything and say, does this also fit with the local realities of funding, of planning efforts to make sure that it does speak to the local realities. So I'll just spend another 2-3 minutes just to go a little bit more into detail on the weighting of some of these criteria, just so that everybody can get a general sense before I hand it off to Sandhya to go into each individual criteria themselves. So I think one thing about the weighting and the structure of this methodology and this score that really makes it stand apart from some of the other ones that we've seen in other methodologies and other places in California, but also beyond, is that there's really a strong focus on high needs areas, which is sort of the catch-all phrase we use to really focus on equity here. So not only the local MTC communities of concern identifier was used for 5 points, but then we wanted to make sure that there was a very strong weighting in that overall category for these high need areas to make sure that this didn't fall by the wayside, and equity really was a focus of this tool. So that's why there are quite a number of different categories all within this high needs area, given a total of 30 out of 100 total points. Secondly, we have proximity destinations. So that's 5 points, like I said, for job sites. I believe, I have to check the number that we settled on in the end, but I believe it was employers over 150 or 200 employers within a quarter-mile radius of the corridor within that buffer. So that was 5 points. Community destinations, as Sanjay will talk about, were user generated. So for the Sunnyvale example, ultimately, we're able to add in destinations that we would define as community destinations. So that could be, you know, anything from sports arenas to community centers, whatever is defined as important to that community there. And that could be added in at the end. And then that's also within a quarter-mile buffer. And then for transit hubs, that was with a half-mile buffer. And the logic there was we wanted to make sure that we had a bikeable catchment area that was a little bit wider. So a street or a corridor that was a little bit further from a transit area, but still within that half-mile buffer was given the extra 5 points for being close enough to a transit hub for it to be considered as close to that destination from a bikeable distance. Then in harm reduction, the reason we see the crash rate has 10 points and fatalities has 5 is that if a corridor got one or had one crash, I believe in the last 5 years, from open source data that we could see, then it would essentially get 5 points for that corridor. If there were over 3 crashes, it would be considered a high crash corridor and we get 10 points. And then another 5 points again if there was even one fatality. So making sure that we can really identify those 3 parameters for harm reduction. And then again, the 5 points for proximity to K-12 schools and proximity to long-term care homes or senior centers. And then finally, the connectivity category, we also have fairly strong weighting here, just like the high need areas. And I think the logic behind this really is that if you don't have a connected bike network and you can't get from point A to point B as efficiently as possible, then people will not necessarily use the bike network as much as you'd like. And we really need to prioritize connectivity as an important factor. So within that score, we have space syntax analysis, which is ultimately an analysis that was developed in University College London. And what it does, you can run it through an open source patch for QGIS software, the open source GIS software, and it's called Depth Map, if anybody's interested. And ultimately, the goal of this analysis is it looks at every single link in a network, and this could be a street network, or it could be they've used this analysis for hallways in IKEA, for example. And ultimately, what it looks at is every single link in the network, what is its through potential to access every other link in the network. And so every link in the network gets scored based on its potential connectivity to everything else. So if something rated high on space syntax, it would get a 10. If it rated sort of medium on space syntax, it would get a 5. And if it rated low, it would not get points for space syntax as a connectivity score on its own. The bikeable street grade, 5 points if the street or the corridor in question was under a 5% slope. So 5% was the threshold that we were looking at, which is often considered the limits of bikeability for all ages and abilities. Again, as this is focused to prioritize all users. And then we really stress the idea of, again, for an all ages and abilities facility and network, there has to be connections to other high grade existing protected all ages and abilities facilities. And so that's why if a corridor passed by and could create a potential connection with an existing protected bike facility, it was given quite a lot of points. It was given 10 points in that case. And the last parameter was ultimately if there's a corridor that closes a gap in the bike network. And this was a parameter Sandhya and John will talk about afterwards about how the tool is actually used. But there are a couple parameters that were not pre-generated by our team, but were ultimately left open, just like community destinations, so that every time the tool is run in certain communities, what some people may consider a community destination or what some people may consider a gap often depends on who's running the tool. And so it allows for that flexibility to have user-generated content sort of halfway through the process, rather than using all of the pre-generated open source data that we built with the SVBC team. So that was a mouthful, and I hope I didn't talk too fast, and I will hand it back to you, Sandhya.
Thanks, Michael. Let's open it up for question and answer so that we can have some questions for you as well before you have to go.
So would you like me to read from the questions? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's been a number of questions in this chat and some we've tried to answer, but let's see. So for Michael, why is language a criteria and how does it relate to bike facility priorities?
I don't know if that's actually a question for me. I think Sandhya, you're probably better to answer that question.
Sure, yeah. So let me jump on to this page. So a non-English speaking majority is actually used as a criteria, and like we wanted to take into consideration equity. We wanted this tool to address equity concerns and also be inclusive about the different communities that live across the area, and that is why non-English speaking majority, which are quite a few dominant areas, especially around certain neighborhoods which get low, which do not which are not high prioritized in terms of lot of developments, are given more points so that they also benefit through this tool and also get considered when there are developments coming across the city.
I guess one point I could add to that too, just for specification of how the high need area categories were also calculated in the actual methodology. I believe if I remember correctly, the low income areas, the low vehicle access areas, and the single caretaker household areas were all essentially, if that census block had over 1/3 of households that fit into that category, then a corridor passing through that block got the point.
Yes.
Or the 5 points in that category. Whereas for non-English speaking majority, it was actually 2/3 to be able to make sure that we actually captured that non-English speaking majority. And then high population was over the median, over the average.
So can you maybe explain a little bit like how these are used? Because someone asked, like made a comment that low income is a criteria mentioned that would exclude Los Gatos from being a priority, would seem, but that's not necessarily how this is being used, as like excluding areas.
No, I mean, it's sort of the opposite. The idea is trying to say, if we're looking at low income or low vehicular access, we're trying to say where are there census blocks that might have been excluded in other methodologies that we can try to give additional points for equity. But again, each of these categories is getting 5 points. So one of these points alone is not going to completely tip the scales, but it is going to give additional focus to a corridor that passes through one of these areas. So if we can try to say that the areas that maybe hit all 5 of these buckets for high need areas, and then they're going to ultimately get 30 additional points, and there is going to be more equity focused on corridors that pass through that census block. Any other thoughts on that, Sandhya?
No, I think that is good.
So there was also a couple questions about how low stress connections are captured within the criteria.
How low stress connections are captured?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Sandy, do you want to go to the page with connectivity? Or the overall, yeah, that works. So ultimately, we had two different parameters, the two at the bottom, the 2 icons at the bottom there, that will essentially touch on gaps in the network. So the one on the right is the one I mentioned at the end, which is essentially user generated at the end of the assessment process with using the tool, so that if there are corridors that are not caught by the tool that are very important to those running the tool, and they know that it's an identified gap in their area, they can actually input those into the tool, and it'll get the points, those 5 points for closing a gap in the network. But the reason I mentioned before that the factor on the bottom left here, the reason that was awarded 10 points is that these are corridors that intersect existing protected connectors. So if there was, for example, if my arm here was a low stress connector and we were looking at my other arm here as the ultimate corridor in question, this would get the extra 10 points for intersecting with the protected connector. So the idea there is to promote strongly with 10 points streets that create networks in and out of existing protected low street connectors.
Yeah, I'll also add here that like as Michael mentioned at the beginning, that our goal is to create a low stress bicycle network. So a later part of the tool also talks about design evaluation, where the tool can tell us that which type of corridor needs which type of bicycle facility. So using that evaluation, also we want to develop a bicycle network that is low stress.
Great. So there were some additional questions. Let's see. I don't think this is the case, but someone asked if temporal issues are considered, like the Stevens Creek Trail is closed after dark, which creates an issue at night only.
Yeah,
No.
unfortunately, temporal issues wouldn't be able to be accounted for unless, unless, unless there is something that connected to if something that could be identified as a gap that actually would allow you to circumvent a place that had a temporal issue, then it could probably account for that. But otherwise, no, the tool could not.
Mm-hmm. So will this tool, or does this tool already take into account where people bike based on public data? And this person gave the example of the Strava, newly released Strava heat map, but was that somehow incorporated in a different way?
So because this tool was also really seeking, like we said before, to zero in on important connections from an equity lens, we did make a decision early on to not take user generated data from things like Strava, which tend to have quite a bit of a bias towards recreational riding, towards, folks that choose to, share their data on these platforms. So the idea was rather, how can we take data that is as widespread, reported from larger agencies and open data sources like that, rather than taking content that is, in a sense, curated through an app like Strava.
This question was about corridors across city boundaries. So the question is, does a high priority corridor in Sunnyvale add weight to a connecting corridor in Santa Clara or Cupertino? But I think that would have to be done individually in the analysis.
Yeah, yes and no. Ultimately, the step where you actually define your, I guess, Sandra, you guys are going to talk about this later when you talk about using the tool, but when you're actually defining your area of study for the tool, because 14 of the 17 parameters were pre-generated for the entire 2-county region. If you're looking at a series of corridors that cross municipal boundaries, or technically you could look at a corridor that was going throughout the entire 2-county region, you could define that as your study zone and still run it just as efficiently, as long as it was within Santa Clara and San Mateo.
Yeah, so basically if you're running it only on City of Santa Clara, and then it will not show streets in San Jose or Sunnyvale as corridors that are intersecting your street. But if you're running this tool on more streets in the entire Santa Clara County, then it might show these streets from other cities as corridors that intersect your existing proposed corridor.
So a couple of questions about how different bike facilities are weighted. So one question was about, do you weigh possible off-road trails that are separated from cars higher than on-street bike lanes? Well, I'll start with that.
No. So ultimately, anything that's a part of the existing network is weighted together. As long as it's a line in the open data set, then ultimately it's going to be factored in. We do have to keep in mind that a lot of the data came from open data sources that we were able to get access to. So there are definitely some small connectors here and there that might be missing. And that is something we could not account for other than getting cleaned up data sets from each individual municipality along the way. We have to distinguish also the fact that the prioritization of corridors and lines in the network is one step versus the design evaluation that Sandhya mentioned before, which once we have a prioritized series of corridors that make up a priority network with this tool, we can then run an analysis on those corridors depending on the existing factors of lane width, on-street parking, and speeds. We can actually then see what would the recommended design evaluation would be at that point.
Okay, sorry, I'm just tracking different things. One question is, what are the factors that make this tool specific to Santa Clara and San Mateo counties?
I'd probably give that one to Sandhya.
So as Michael mentioned, we basically studied before arriving to this tool and before deriving these 17 criteria, we studied VTA guidelines, we studied Measure W guidelines, and also went through bike plans that are existing in different cities. And that was our basis of arriving at these 17 criteria. So that makes it more specific for these two counties. Also, the base file or the master file that we have created has data only for these two counties. We'll come to what a master file is in the next section, but it is specific only to these two counties right now.
And I think again, you're going to touch on this later, Sandhya, but I think, an important piece to remember when talking about this process is that it also went through a first testing phase with Sunnyvale. So the goal was we developed based on what we had seen in other local plans, based on Measure W, based on VTA guidelines, we were able to create a first draft of the scoring and weighting. But from there, it went through multiple iterations as we ran it through the Sunnyvale model to see if it actually was representative of what local advocacy can actually recognize on the streets there. So like I said before, we were helping guide through the process, but ultimately really relying on SVBC's local knowledge of if it really did reflect a reality that made sense in the Sunnyvale context.
Yes, and it is like the data files for this tool are specific to these two counties, but we also have the data collection handbook or the lookbook in general, which so using that, it can be duplicated for any other county in the region. So we haven't really gone into details of creating those files for other counties, but other counties can take that as a base and create their own data files to run this tool in their respective area. So maybe just one more question and then we can move on.
I think the last question here will be answered more in the next section, which is about how hard it will be to keep the data up to date. So I think that would be it for Michael.
Okay, well, I think I'm going to jump off, and I think there's a dog that needs a late night walk here, given that it's 9:40. But thanks for having me, guys, and have a good rest of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us.
Take care.
Okay, so the next section for tonight is how exactly do we use this tool? So first, to make it easy and to save time, we have created a data library of all the relevant data, which would be required as a base for using this tool in any jurisdiction in San Mateo or Santa Clara County. This base file includes 14 out of 7 data for 14 out of 17 criteria that we just talked about in the previous section. So how do we generate the 3 remaining criteria? So these are the 3 criteria that need to be locally generated by the user. One is community centers, senior centers. So for community centers and senior centers, you will need to create a Google Maps file. And for gap closure, it is more like a binary input where you say yes or no in the final spreadsheet that is created. Then once you have this locally generated data and the base file ready, the next step is to merge both of these files together, and that will create your master segment file. Now next we come to creating a query data layer. So this tool can be run on any select set of corridors. So you can run it on all streets in, say, city of Milpitas, or you can run it across only arterials across entire San Mateo County. Or maybe you can just break El Camino Real into segments from Daly City to San Jose and run it on El Camino Real. So you decide as a user what exactly is your query data layer, which are the corridors you want to run this tool on, which are the corridors you want to find out which need to be prioritized. So that can be created either on Google Maps, or that can be easily imported from the city's website. And finally, once we have the query data layer and the master segment file, we export this data into spreadsheets, and then we get a final scoring sheet. So this is a rough template of how exactly the tool works. So finally, this is a rough template of how exactly the tool works. So we will get, the tool evaluates complete corridors and assigns every corridor a score out of 100 points. Using the final scores, we can input those scores back into GIS, and a map can be generated using those scores. So high point scores will maybe have a darker color, and low scoring corridors will have a lighter color. The second step, or the second piece that we can achieve out of this tool, is that the top corridors can be evaluated for their appropriate all ages and abilities bicycle facility. So basically, what do we do once we have the project list ready? Our next step is to find out what kind of bicycle facility would be most suitable for each of these corridors. This can be done in two ways. Either you can use vehicle volumes plus speeds data. This is generally available with the city, or if it is hard to get, we can use lane width plus number of lanes. This part can be easily found or can be calculated using Google Maps. It is important to remember that the tool does not take into account how much space is available and whether the bike facility is feasible or not. It will just tell you what type of bicycle facility would be most suitable based on safety, what type of bicycle facility would be most suitable to make it low stress for a person who is biking. Also, another important segregation is that this tool is based on corridors and it is not based on segments or projects. So a bike plan will have several projects, like it might have sidewalk improvements, it might have intersection improvements, it might have traffic light improvements. But this tool only concentrates on corridors. So it are also like, we believe that if we have smaller segments instead of a complete corridor, that will create a lot of gaps in the network. So that is why we have given priority to using corridors in this tool, so that entire corridors are completed and we get a more complete bicycle network in the area. Finally, the final set of assessment is doing readiness evaluation. This stage is like giving bonus points to projects which are shovel ready so that things get implemented faster. We recommend conducting this evaluation on high priority corridors alone. It does not need to be conducted on across all the streets that you're testing. This criteria is primarily meant to be as a tiebreaker. So the scoring needs to be done manually, and here are the criteria. The corridors get additional bonus points if it is identified in any other planning efforts, if the project has already undergone design or environmental review, or the project has funding potential. With this, let's move on to what are the results when we tested this tool in Sunnyvale. John will be taking us through this section of the presentation.
Thank you, Sonia. All right, so I'll be walking us through the analysis we did in Sunnyvale. In Sunnyvale, we did an active transportation plan, which was a combination of a bicycle master plan, a pedestrian master plan, and a safe routes to school plan. But the tool is only evaluating the bicycle master plan piece versus what's in the Sunnyvale ATP. We picked Sunnyvale because it's a fairly large city. It was undergoing its bike plan right at this time, at the same time we were developing the tool. We thought it was fairly representative of a lot of the cities around us as far as density of housing and different kinds of communities and different locations of businesses. And it's got a lot of important connections for people going to and from jobs in different places. So it was just a good decision to test this tool on Sunnyvale, since we had the Sunnyvale bicycle plan being developed at the same time. So I'm just kind of hinted at the fact that this tool is a higher level view. It's trying to help us figure out what an ideal low stress bicycle network would look like. So it's not constrained by any parts of reality per se, as far as like we talked about lane width or any of those other things. It's really idealized in thinking about, you know, if you want to go from A to B in a low stress network, what streets need to be improved and what improvements need to be made on them to make that happen. Next slide. So this on the right is the map of the testing in Sunnyvale. The darker the color, the more important the street. So what you're seeing is that Wolf Road, which is a major street going through Sunnyvale, over here kind of in the eastern third, was, according to the tool, the highest scoring street. It's got a score of 85 out of a possible 100. It's 3.7 miles long. And what the tool predicts based on the number of traffic lanes, et cetera, because we never got actual volumes and speeds from the city, is a class 4 protected facility. So in the ideal network, that's what you would want to put there based on, you know, the need, which is the 85 score, and then to make it low stress, it would need to be a class 4 facility. Now, underneath that, you can see what actually was included in the Sunnyvale Bicycle Master Plan, which was 4 separate projects, you know, a 0.1 mile long section in one spot, a 0.6 mile long section in one spot, a 0.3 mile one section, and a 0.1, which is only just over a mile, right? So the Sunnyvale Master Plan is what we were trying to avoid, right? It just creates little islands of good stuff with lots of gaps in between. And nobody goes across the Golden Gate Bridge when it's only 90% built, right? So our philosophy is you've got to focus on building the entire corridor, not focus on little spot improvements in a corridor. So, you know, if you're going to go make Wolf bicycle friendly, you need to make it bicycle friendly from top to bottom, not here, there, and a few other places in between. So we had a you know, interesting discussion with Sunnyvale as they were developing it. Sunnyvale used 6 criteria to decide how to prioritize their projects, and each of them just got 1 point. So their scores were somewhere between 6 points for something that was a high need or high priority, and 1 point for things that were low priority. So I want to stop here for questions. If anybody has any before I move on to understand the basics of what we were doing, right? This is a network priority tool trying to figure out the best network based on desirability of corridors in Sunnyvale.
Okay.
Okay.
There haven't been questions coming in so far, so.
Yep, great. All right, on to the next slide, Sandhya. So, you know, that was the scoring, that was the map. This is kind of the storytelling part of the tool, right? So once you've got your map and you've got your list of priority corridors, this is, the intent is to make it simple for people to understand by taking the data and turning it into stories. So one of the stories that we would create and trying to convince people to do what the NTP is saying, you know, in the top 30 corridors, and we looked at the top 30 corridors, and out of 100 corridors we ranked and said, you know, those cover 88% of the bicycle and pedestrian collisions in Sunnyvale, right? So this is taking the data that we got from the tool and then trying to make it into a story to help convince people why they should prioritize the streets that the map recommends. Yeah, here's another example. So, you know, 33% of the schools in Sunnyvale need access to a protected bikeway. You know, we'd like to have that, but today only 18% of them have a bike lane going to them, and that's the class 2 generally today. So these are examples of taking the data, looking at it, and then developing stories from it. When I talk about what is the most appropriate bikeway for a street, again, the tool is trying to create a low stress network without actually doing the whole separate stress analysis before and stress analysis after, just by predicting a certain quality of infrastructure based on the size of the road. So I see a few questions going in by the chat in this. So generally the tool is, you know, depending on the side of the road, it's either going to recommend it become a class 4 protected bikeway, because that's the best low stress option, a class 1 path next to the street, or a class 3 bike boulevard, right? Because those are the low stress choices that we think most interested but concerned riders would use. So that's a general recommendation in the tool. It just looks at the size of the road and says, you know, it should either have class 1, class 4, or if it's low enough volume and small enough street, like a more residential street or an arterial, it'll predict, say, you know, maybe what's the right choice for this street is a bike boulevard. So hopefully that answers that question for most people. Next, please, Sandhya. Oh, great. So any more questions about that? I think I covered the high level, right? In that this is creating an ideal model that's going to connect people with where they want to go and creating a safe, you know, so that's the network piece. And then the safe piece is the recommended protected infrastructure, either class 1, class 4, or class 3 bike boulevard. Because those are the 3 facilities we know that interested but concerned people would actually use. And of course, they help everybody, right? So all the users from 8 to 80 also helps, if we make these improvements for bicyclists, it also makes it safer for drivers. It also makes it safer for pedestrians. Right?
Thanks, John. I'm not sure if this question was answered, but does this take into account the brakes and driveways and public transportation along a corridor?
No, it does not. So again, it's just recommending an ideal solution. It's recommending, in general, it just says, this corridor is important, put something protected here. And generally by the width of the street, if it's a wide street with 4 lanes of traffic, it's going to say put a protected facility in somehow. It's not going to look at the details of, oh, it would be hard, that's a separate question of, if we're going to put something protected here, what would be the best choice on this particular section of street? That's another level down below what this tool is trying to do.
Yeah, this tool is more of a macro level understanding of which destinations do we need to connect, where does the city need a bicycle network. As I also mentioned before, it does not get into specifics of whether the bicycle facility we are proposing is feasible for that particular street or not, in terms of driveways or in terms of available space on the street and so on. It's more like a macro level understanding of what is required at the city level.
And then did you answer the question about how hard will it be to keep the data up to date as the street network changes?
Sure, I can address that. Or Sonia, you want to take it?
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Okay, so all the data sources that are in that database are publicly available, and so you can just update them every couple of years. SVBC is planning on doing the updates, and like we talked about to some other people, we can do it for, if some other county wants to do it, they can do the same thing because it's all publicly sourced data. So it's not a big problem to update the data sources every 2 years.
Okay, that's all the questions, I think.
Okay, so with that, we move on to conclusion, limitations, and next steps. So this tool was created in concert with various planning efforts in the area, and this tool can be run by anyone. So it can be run by any agency staff, it can be run by any organization, or it can also be run by any individual. Insights from the tool that we just saw as examples from the city of Sunnyvale are helpful in creating a complete low stress network, and are also helpful to maybe create awareness among the community, or maybe get your elected on board and do other campaigning efforts or advocacy efforts. Because more than just throwing data, having data in a form of a storytelling method helps more people understand and get on board. City staff can use this tool to compare results with their bike plan, or the bike plan is generally updated once in 10 to 15 years. The project list needs to be more updated. So the city staff can run this tool every 2 years to stay up to date on their priority list. And individuals and organizations can also use this tool to enable data-driven advocacy, as we just talked about. Like any other tool, our tool also has some limitations. One, it cannot model non-existing streets, trails, bridges, or development projects. So as John gave an example of the East Channel Trail in Sunnyvale, which is a parallel street to Wolf Road, it is not existing right now. And so the current tool does not take into consideration or does not score this trail. Similarly, for any bridges that are proposed across 101 or over Caltrain are not taken into account for this tool. It is also based only on existing situation data. So it takes into account only existing population, existing land use, or existing bicycle projects. It does not take into consideration proposed development projects, proposed housing that might bring in a lot of increase the population for a certain area. So it does not take into account for those projections. But we will keep this data up to date. So we'll be updating population data, land use changes, crash data, bicycle facility data every 2 years so that this tool is up to date. And lastly, this tool is targeted towards roadway analysis, and hence trails score comparatively low. Another reason why trails score comparatively low that is because it will get very less points when it comes to harm reduction, because they're already safe. They do not have a lot of crashes, or they do not really have a lot of fatalities. So that is why they will score really low when it comes to harm reduction. Also, the trails are generally on the outskirts of a city, so they will score less when it comes to connections to job sites, or when it comes to high need areas in terms of population density, or connecting to low income neighborhoods and so on. That is why trails automatically are scored comparatively less in this tool. And what are the next steps we're going to do using this tool? So SVBC plans to approach cities who are currently updating their bike ped plan so that they can run this tool alongside, and this tool can probably influence or help arrive at their final prioritized list before they actually publish it. We'll also be presenting at BPAC and council meetings wherever there is interest for city staff to run this tool. We'll also encourage all of our SVBC local teams to run it on their respective cities. And as we mentioned before, we will be updating this database every 2 years so that our tool is up to date and can be used by anyone at any point. So with that, we come to the end of this presentation. Any questions?
There is a question about how long does it take to run this tool, and maybe you can speak about what the volunteers have been doing and testing, the testers as well.
Yes. So so far we've tested this with a few beta testers, and we found out that it takes somewhere between 5 hours to 10 hours for a person to run this entire tool, right from creating the locally generated layers to arriving at the final map and then doing the design evaluation. So based on how comfortable you are with GIS already, if you're using it for the first time, it might take a little longer. But if you already are acquainted with GIS, it might take you a little less. So it's roughly between 5 to 10 hours.
Any other questions? That's all, I think all of them that are, there was a question from Amy, but I wasn't sure what you meant by that, Amy, if you want to retype that. I don't know if she's still there. Any other questions? Okay. Oh,
Thank you, everyone.
oh, sorry, one other thing. I know you said it can't model proposed bridges. Is that a feature you plan to add?
Not right now. If we do plan to make tweaks to the tool, it might be sometime next year, but at least right now we do not plan to make any changes. Also, as I mentioned, since Seema, you brought this up, I'd like to highlight what we did for example for East Channel Trail. So East Channel Trail is currently parallel to Wolf Road in Sunnyvale. And as you saw, Wolf Road scored the highest points in our network priority tool. So, and East Channel Trail is parallel to Wolf Road and it's just a few blocks away. Since this tool does not score East Channel Trail, but using Wolf Road scoring as a reference point, it can be shown that how important East Channel Trail is in Sunnyvale, even though it does not score East Channel Trail directly. So that is how it can be done for projects that are not existing, that are proposed. It can be used using references from other streets that are scored in this tool.
There are some additional questions now. Does the tool come with any built-in base maps or shape files to help easily create one?
Yes, so as I mentioned that the tool comes with a base file which has data for 14 criteria out of 17. So you can use that as a base file, and you will have to create a few layers that are locally generated, but it is very easy to create those. And the tool has a user manual which has a step-by-step guideline, which has tutorial videos to help you guide through all the steps. It has screenshots for each and every step. So even a person who has never used QGIS before can easily go through all those steps using screenshots and tutorial videos, and it will help you through all the steps one by one.
And someone asked, like, are we reaching out to public agencies? And I'll just say, yes, we are. And we want to share this as broadly as possible, which is partially why we did this event. And there are a number of cities who have either recently done their bike plan or are about to update their bike plan. So we'll definitely be reaching out to them, because it is useful to run an analysis with this tool on even like a bike plan that's already been created, just to see how the projects have, you know, kind of line up. Anything else with that, Sandhya, you want to say?
No, I think that's great.
Okay.
So yes, if you have any further questions, or if you get stuck while running this tool, or if you want us to present at your BPAC or city staff meeting or city council meeting, please reach out to any of us. We'll be happy to present and talk to you more about it. We also have a few, we'll be hiring a few volunteers to help us out with this tool. So if a city wants to run this tool but does not have enough bandwidth, we can help you out. Maybe we can get halfway there, and you can do half of the running of the tool on your own.
Sorry, one more question. Is the tool already up on our website, or where can people access it?
Yes, it is already on our website, and let me share the link. It also has a step-by-step guideline about how to get started. So how you first basically install QGIS, and then from where can you download the user manual files, that is the base files, and what are the steps covered in the user manual. And here is the link. Just put it in the chat box. Okay, so looks like that's it. Thank you everyone for joining, and wish you all a wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you.